Okay, everybody, if you can hear me, my name is Stephen Bardwell. I apologize for the technical problems, but we'll make up for that time, no problem. We'll be covering, as you know, public safety and community risk reduction, CRR, during disasters and major emergencies. Okay, John, if you can hear me, advance the slide. Okay, I think I'm with you now. Okay, just a little bit about my background. I got started as serving the public as a sanitation worker. I became a volunteer firefighter, a career firefighter, EMS supervisor. Okay, EMS supervisor. And I started working at the State Fire Academy, and I worked my way up to instructor chief. And I've been working as National Fire Academy, a female instructor. And I retired a couple of years ago as instructor chief at State Fire Academy, and I serve as the Fire Science Program Director at Bardwell University. Next slide. Okay, even though we're virtual for this presentation, I'm going to look at it as though I'm primarily a facilitator, and I'm going to encourage networking. Some of you may be attending the webinar alone, but some of you may be with some other people. So we do encourage networking and open discussion. We're virtual, so we really can't have the open discussion that we normally would have in a big regular conference type setting. But if you're among some people, I do encourage open discussion about things, and also encourage voicing different views and different thoughts and sharing experience, lessons learned. Just make sure we be professional. Okay, next slide. Basically, what we're going to be covering in the agenda is assistant ESF 13, public safety and security. Also, community risk reduction, as we talked about for disasters. We're going to be looking at emergency management. We're going to be looking at expanded CRR programs and being proactive. We're also going to look at the whole community approach and adapted communities. We're going to emphasize a little bit more about adapted communities in just a little bit. Next slide. The adaptive, as we talked about, that's going to deal with adaptive leadership, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, looking at the ESF 13, I'm not going to go over everything that's included in that, but a few words we want to emphasize in that is public safety and security. That's a few words we want to emphasize in that. All right, next slide. Now, as we look at those words we want to emphasize assistance. In other words, they're there to provide assistance. Okay, next slide. Then we'll also look at when resources may become overwhelmed by the results. Next slide. Okay, let's advance again there. All right. So basically, when we look at ESF 13, basically the nature of the incident is going to determine how much they're involved. It can be terrorism, natural disaster. Okay, next slide. But that brings us to the question, what if law enforcement is not available? So we have to ask ourselves, are we part of public safety? Are we here to provide assistance? Will people who are overwhelmed expect something from us? Next. The answer is yes, yes, and yes. Now, I believe we have several participants, so I believe a lot of you have already experienced this. In other words, what I'm saying is law enforcement may be there during the disaster or the major emergency, but then they may not be there, or they may be there and have to leave and do something else. And of course, the people are going to look at us, hey, you're public safety, you're here to provide assistance. Okay. All right, Next slide. Talking about the evolving role of law enforcement in disasters. Now, traditionally, they've had the standard roles such as keeping the peace and protecting lives and property and so forth. And this has probably been because of cultural distances that law enforcement has had in disaster preparedness. What I'd like to do is ask everybody, why do you think law enforcement traditionally have maintained a cultural distance when they talk about expanded disaster preparedness? One of the events that changed that was the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Just one of them. There's been some other incidents, some natural disasters. And one of the things that's really been emphasized there is interagency communications. Okay. Next slide. All right, we're looking at evolving them in disaster response. One of the things that have taken place is more training. I know a lot of you out there have been involved with disaster and exercise year training with law enforcement, but what we are, you've been involved with them for years. What we're encouraging is expand their roles, even in the planning. Right? And we've seen this take place in some of our major hurricanes over the past years. And as you know, we've had some major incidents that's taken place this year, right in the state of Iowa, and our Gulf Coast, as you know, have encountered a record number of hurricanes. So we've seen this take place. We've seen law enforcement's role evolve, and they take on more roles. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think it's some things that I'm not seeing, but that's okay. Hey, we're going to look at community risk reduction from an expanded perspective. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, a few minutes ago, we touched on, we've seen law enforcement expanded role have some success in some of our recent, over the last 5 years, rather, incidents. So with this, we're going to emphasize the community-based disaster risk reduction, and we've had a lot of success with this, and we're going to elaborate on some of those. We're going to elaborate on some of those, okay? And some of them have been very successful. All right, next. Looking at community-based disaster risk reduction, we want to start with the responders and the citizens who volunteer. You know, a lot of you have good programs that's been in place for a while. You know, the CERT program and so forth that we'll touch on later. And you have some programs where they've been really helpful and very, very much involved, but we want to start with responders. When we talk about community risk reduction, make sure our responders and the citizens who volunteer, make sure they understand what we want to accomplish with community risk reduction. Overall, naturally, we want to reduce their risks. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in just a second. Now, got to remember the incident response priorities. Okay, next, remember those incident response priorities where we start to look at life safety. Okay, next slide. And we start to look at life safety, and we start to look at responding. Now, for emergency responders, generally we all practice that, whereas life safety is going to be our number one response. Well, I do want to ask this question. I know we're virtually, but I do want to ask this question. We're concerned with the life safety, but whose life safety is that top priority? Now, we're all probably saying, well, the emergency responders. Well, and the citizens, of course, is a top priority, but we have to remember that we have to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of the citizens. This is nothing that we're going to go out there and advertise that, hey, we're ahead of you. No, we don't do that. But we have to consider our life safety. We have to consider responding. So when we have these disasters, and we may have drills, we may have exercises where we feel like, hey, our people are prepared. Yep, our people are prepared. But yet, when that incident occurs, it's a little different from the drill, isn't it? It's a little different from the drill. So we have to be concerned with our general and basic injuries, like the photograph that shows the firefighter carrying a tool. When we talk about risk management during a disaster, we have to remember the basic things, because a simple back sprain or twisted ankle, that can disrupt a big task. Kind of just like a football game for a quarterback twist the ankle or whatever. Also, we have to remember that responders and our volunteers' families, they're also affected. Some of the disasters and major emergencies that I've responded to, we came there to do rescue and recovery, but some of us have had to go in and assist with some of the emergency responders and their families, or either take over what they were, some of their duties. Some of us have had to go in and work at fire station because some of the firefighters and law enforcement officers were affected by the disaster. So that's something we have to consider too. All right, next. Example, firefighter down or law enforcement officer down. This can have a big impact. Now, we're not saying that these can be prevented, but we are saying when we are planning and preparing, let's look at some things that we may not anticipate occurring. For example, who's going to rescue the rescuer? All right, next. Confined space situation. These are some, as you know, these are these can be very dangerous situations right here. Confined space rescues. And we practice for these, but when that adrenaline is rolling and the disaster is taking place, then it may be a little bit different than the drill or the practice. Also, we have to remember our environmental factors. It could be 90-something degrees with high humidity. It could be raining. All right, next. The old general hazardous material type response. Again, we have to make sure our responders practice risk reduction measures, not just plain safety. Everybody, let's be safe. Of course, we want safety, but we want risk reduction measures. Example, if we have people who are going to be going in as a 2-person hazardous material team, during their training, they're emphasized, hey, you have to be sitting down. You need to be sitting down before you go in. And this is something we have to really emphasize, because those people will have a tendency to get involved with things when they're actually supposed to be resting. Okay, next. Okay, just another photo of a technical type rescue. We don't always see these during disasters, during major emergencies, but they can occur, and some of these are very difficult to prepare for. For example, this is actually a photograph of some training that's going on, and these people can say, hey, look, we got it. But during a major emergency or disaster, the atmosphere may be a little different. Okay, next. Looking at that community-based disaster risk reduction, one of the things this is going to do is help our people to express their real needs and priorities, their real needs. Now, when we are working with our people, we may feel that, okay, I think I know what they need. We may not. Sometimes people may not be upfront with us of some concerns that they may have during a disaster. So when we're doing the community-based disaster risk reduction, it allows the problems to be defined correctly, and that helps us be more effective with our responsive measures. Next. We have to keep in mind that people at the community level, they have more to lose. Well, they live there. Sometimes they're directly hit by the disaster, some areas more so than others, and some may be more vulnerable. Now, looking at that, they have the most to gain. No one gains, so to say, anything from a disaster, but the point we're making there is with a good disaster community risk reduction plan and planning ahead and with good mitigation plans, this can help reduce the impact in the community. Again, finding out the specific and the exact needs. We're going to talk about some unique needs in just a minute. And next. A few of the programs, that we'll look at, the whole community approach, the adapted communities, and the CERT. Some of you, I'm sure, have all of these implemented. Most everybody will have the CERT. We're not going to elaborate much on the CERT, but we're going to mention a few things about it. But the whole community approach, the adapted communities, we're going to talk a little bit about those. All right, next. Looking at the whole community approach. Next slide. The whole community approach is basically just as it states there, looking at the entire community. This could involve something from acts of terrorism, natural disasters that we may experience only once in our lifetime. And one thing we have to remember about the whole community approach is it's your community and what you consider as part of your community. Some of your community may go outside your city limits. Some of your communities may involve this rural area. But if your community is rural, another community may consider themselves as part of your community. All right, next. But again, with that whole community, we have to look at everything: citizens, emergency management, community leaders, government officials, businesses. This whole approach hopefully gives us a better opportunity to assess our needs, okay, enhance our organization, and strengthen us in areas. Okay, next. Okay, with this approach, we have what we refer to as a national dialogue. And basically what we're saying here is a collective group of learning experiences, where one community learns from another. You got citizens who survived, responders who were able to assist, responders who were greatly impacted. And this can also help us be even more actively involved in our planning and community development. Next. Looking at our pathways for action. One of the things we want to do is increase education on diversity of the community. And we hear a lot about diversity. We do. We hear a lot about that. But one thing we want to emphasize is having a shared understanding of the needs and the capabilities. We want to emphasize these capabilities because one thing that may be overlooked a lot is we may have some resources and capabilities within our community that we may be overlooking. Okay? And also, it gives an opportunity to empower some of our members of the community and integrate some of our resources. In other words, this neighborhood over here may have some resources that this neighborhood was not aware of, and this neighborhood over here may have some resources that law enforcement may not have known about and say, hey, that's great. Okay, all right, next. Continuing with that about the increased education on the diversity in the communities. Again, we hear a lot about diversity, but we want to emphasize the inclusion part. And of course, this helps enhance relationships, build partnerships, stronger social infrastructure, and of course, increase our adaptiveness. And as I stated a minute ago, we want to talk a little bit more in depth about adaptiveness in just a little bit. Okay, next. We're looking at understanding the actual needs. Actual needs. Now, earlier we talked about some people may not let us know exactly this is what they need, and sometimes our people may not know what they need. So we can work with them and try to find out what are the actual needs, what are the capabilities of the whole community. You want to engage that whole community, looking at that, a deeper understanding. Some people with some areas have a unique need. It may be a diverse need. It's not strange. It's just a different need. Example, we may feel like, hey, MREs, meals ready to eat. Hey, look, this is really good. We got some of those over there, but those may not be suitable for everyone. And within our audience, I think we probably got a lot of people who said, oh yeah, we have definitely considered that, and we offer this, and we try to make way of this. But know your community and keep current. We may feel like, oh, I know my community. I know what this is about. Well, sometimes we may think that we know, but there may be a lot that we don't know. So try to keep current with what's going on in communities, in your community. Okay, next. When we're looking at our community needs, our overall objectives, of course, isn't it understanding community needs? And basically what we're saying here is providing what is needed beyond what is addressed by traditional emergency management capabilities. What are we talking about here? What we're saying is when that disaster hits, or even when it is forecast, responders, citizens may have a mindset of, okay, I'm going to be without this. Okay, we're going to suffer this. Okay. Now they may, and the responders may be limited, but our overall objective is try to provide services beyond that. Try to provide services beyond that. We may be limited, but that is our overall objective. We don't want our people to kind of look at the misfortunes and so forth, like that's just a norm when it comes to a disaster. Now, we may be limited what we can do, but our objective is to try to provide beyond those traditional measures. All right, next. Looking at effective disaster communication. Customer focus. We've been talking about and mentioning the community. Now, when we look at customers, we look at the communities, but we have to also consider internal customers. Everybody think just for a second. Who are your internal customers? Think about where you work. If you supervise people, those can be your those are your internal customers. If someone supervises you, that can be an internal customer. So we've got internal and external customers. Not saying that one is more important, but we do have customers. So this communication, we have to have the leadership commitment. Have to have that. Okay? And be focused on situational awareness, looking at timely collection, dissemination of information. One thing we want to emphasize about dissemination of that information, and this can work with our media partnership, is information that can be communicated. Let's make sure it's communicated in a timely, professional manner. Let's be sure that it can. But now we do understand there's some information that we do not want shared right now. Okay, next. Talking about empowering the whole community. Better position our stakeholders, get all the people in the community involved. Social groups. We got social groups here, we got social groups there. For example, the deaf community. I put that word friend there because it's very important that our deaf community know that before the disaster occurs, during the disaster, and after disaster, just like any other group, we are there. We're there as a friend, as their service providers. And one thing I want to emphasize here, dealing with the deaf community, is some deaf communities are not in favor of being referred to as hearing impaired. Now we know that we'll say that sometimes because we feel we're being polite by saying that. But many deaf communities do not view the word deaf like we may view the word deaf. They may feel that, I won't say insulted, but being referred to as hearing impaired may not be the most suitable. Again, that goes back with knowing your communities, knowing your communities. Okay? So our institutions, be familiar with what's going on there, faith-based groups, retired persons, schools, all of those. These can be stakeholders and they can have a greater role. Let's engage them. Okay, next. Talking about your citizens core type council. Some of you got some really involved groups in your communities and want to encourage seeking, as we mentioned earlier, that diverse staff. And let's just not hire them. Let's include them. They have a lot to offer. Let's include them. And I do want to emphasize, let's not overlook the deaf community, or we want to say hearing impaired people, and let's not overlook people with some physical limitations. Because you may notice places like Walmart are hiring people with some physical limitations. Some fire departments are hiring people with physical limitations to serve in certain roles, such as fire inspectors. But we want to look at involving children and youth groups. And I want to back up just a second, emphasizing that clear communications with all. Make sure it's ongoing, consistent, and the right vocabulary. You ever notice sometimes we speak with the group and it's like we're talking straight over their head or talking straight to the side, or they're speaking with us and we're not connecting with them. So let's make sure that we use the right vocabulary. And if we don't understand their vocabulary, then let's try to. Also, remember those informal leaders. I want everybody to think just for a second right now. Think about your community. Think about some people who could be an informal leader in your community, someone who's not necessarily in a supervisory position or council, city council, or anything like that. But they have the ear for the people in their neighborhood or in their group. So we have to remember those informal leaders. Also, we want to emphasize incorporating emergency planning discussion in some of your existing community meetings. There may be some meetings that take place generally within your community. They may meet once a month. Some may meet twice a month or whatever. But if possible, we would like to be there or for them to include something maybe at the end that engages them. Remember, those of you who you're needed to join on the CERT team, or we're going to have a disaster drill coming up, but we want to incorporate this in that. And when we do all that, next, this is what we're going to find, is we'll discover resources that we never knew about. If we incorporate and empower this whole community and consider all these, I think we're going to be very pleased with the resources that we have locally and right next door. Okay, next. We want to strengthen what works well in your community, looking at the daily lives, existing relationships. What are some existing relationships that we have maybe from this neighborhood, from this informal leader, okay? And then want to leverage and empower prior to the disaster. Again, getting that relationship going. As you know, when the disaster occurs, that's not the best time to establish a relationship. Earlier, we mentioned about media partners. Some of you serve now or have served as the public information officer, the PIO. And when I'm teaching classes on PIO, one thing I always emphasize is get that relationship established. When the disaster strikes is not a time to establish that relationship. Sometimes people say, well, those darn TV camera people and this, I told them to stay over there. Let's get that relationship established. And I think we'll find that things will flow a whole lot better at that incident, because we need our media partners. Our media partners need us, and we need them too. Okay, next. Again, looking at your community, if there's anything complex in it. Earlier we mentioned some communities are unique, where they may have some unique needs. Within your community, you may have some areas that have some uniqueness about it. Not saying it's better or anything like that, but just some uniqueness about it. That comes in with knowing your community. This is going to help with tailoring our engagement strategies. How are we going to engage these people over here? How are we going to engage these people over here? If we have a diverse community, we're not likely to have a one-size-fits-all type of concept for engaging our communities. Know our communities. For example, we may have an isolated population. Some people live in rural areas to where they are not very open to people outside their areas. No, they're not very open. I get the chance to teach, as I mentioned, for FEMA and the National Fire Academy. I've taught in classes in 37 states, and I really love going and engaging with people in various communities. And some people may say, well, those people in that county, they're very closed. They may think that is something specific, and it's just done like that in their state, but it's not. It's not. So we may have some isolated populations of some people who are not as open. So we may have to be creative in establishing these relationships. Okay, understand the community DNA. Everybody think just for a second. What in the world do we mean by community DNA? Well, it's going to be pretty much like any other. What's the characteristics there? What's passed on? What's that community about? So we have to look at social activities and how issues are generally resolved there. Are they generally swept under the rug or whatever? Okay. All right, next. Let's look at our disaster adapted communities. Now, we've been touching on the word adapted for a while. And by the way, I want to thank the Iowa Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for allowing me to use some of the photographs on their website. All right, let's look at the next slide. Talk about adaptive challenges. Adaptive challenges. We've got some solutions with adaptive challenges. But before we go into solutions, let's look at what are we meaning by adaptive challenges. Basically, this is when something exists where there's got to be a change within those people. So some of the solutions is changing the habits, changing the beliefs, changing attitudes, values, and we help the people obtain new discoveries. How does this fit into disaster preparedness, community risk reduction for disasters? It fits because our people sometimes have a set way that they view things, and this can impact disasters. This starts with our emergency responders. This can include our media, our citizens. And like I said, our emergency responders, our law enforcement community, our fire, emergency management, city council members. They may all have a certain habit. So there are different values that we have to look at and show them that, hey, look, a change may be needed here, a change may be needed there. And basically what we're talking about, everybody, is a concept of adaptive leadership. That's something we've been seeing. I know many of you have seen a good bit of that, but that's a concept that we've been seeing more and more of over the past few years, and some of us even longer. And that's a concept we can expect to see even more when we look at adaptive leadership. Okay, next. All right, carrying on with that disaster adapted communities. We're going to look at creating collaborate groups, identifying potential disasters, even if it's minor. Now, I do want to ask, think about small rural community in your state, or think about a small incorporated town in your state. Can they have an incident that could be considered a disaster for them, but it wouldn't necessarily be a disaster for Des Moines or Lincoln, Nebraska, or Chicago? So we have to look at the potential for disaster. So again, what could be a disaster for them, because that can disrupt. Yeah, that can disrupt them. Then helping people to understand their role. Okay, next, helping them to understand their role. Sometimes we may have a written assessment of the risk. Okay, and let's look at some action steps. Let's keep going. Looking at some action steps. Something we've touched on earlier, identifying partnerships. Being ready to take this action. And look at that step at the bottom there. Reevaluate the work. Reevaluate. Is it possible that some of the things that we're doing, we may find that is not as effective as we would like for it to be? Yes, that's possible. We can reevaluate and we can say, okay, you know what? I think we're going to do this instead. And we're going to do this instead. Now, the people who are part of planning, if we make some revisions, let's make sure that it's communicated and timely. And again, get people impact on how things are working. So when we evaluate, we don't have to always look at the impact from the community. We can get some feedback from our customers, so to say. All right, next. These are some examples where we've seen some success with disaster adaptive communities. Just a few examples, and it's been way more than this, but these are just a few examples. Okay, next. Community emergency response teams. As I stated, I'm not going to elaborate a whole lot on these because I know a lot of you have implemented these teams. Let's look at the next slide. A lot of you have implemented these teams. Here. We've got all types of campus cert, team cert, and so forth. But one thing I want to emphasize about these teams is how can we ensure that our citizens know about this program? I want everybody to think just for a second. You may or may not have a cert implemented in your community. You may have another program that accomplish the same objectives as a cert. But I want everybody to think about it, whether you have one team or not. Think about how can we do an even better job ensuring that our citizens know about our programs and know what's involved and know how they can be a resource. The reason I'm bringing this up is it hasn't even been a week. It's probably been 4 days ago, maybe 4 days ago. I was in a conversation with a person who is a former chemist, former school teacher, and she was emphasizing that she wants to be involved. She lives in a large city and she wants to be involved more in the community. And she even stated, say, well, if she wasn't at a certain point in life, she'd go and try to be a firefighter. And I joked with her and said, well, you can still be a firefighter. And I asked her about the CERT team, but before I did this, I looked and see that her city had one. Her city's got one, a very active team. And she said that she didn't know anything about it, and she was overwhelmed. And she immediately contacted them and like, hey, look, I want to get involved. Not only is this team going to benefit her, this program going to benefit her, but the program is going to benefit from her as well because she has a lot to offer. Remember earlier, we talked about when we do the whole community approach and we look at our informal leaders, our different groups, a deaf community, and so forth, we said that we will discover resources that we never knew that we had. So that's one thing that I want to emphasize about the CERT team. I know everybody knows all about these, but I do want to emphasize, how can we ensure that our citizens know about the program? Now we can say, well, it's on our website, and we've mentioned it at this event, and we may be doing a really good job, beautiful website. But remember, we talked about some communities are different. And then we have to look at communicating it the right way. Sometimes the word CERT may not be the best way to communicate it to them. Sometimes we may say, hey, we've got a program that allows you to get directly involved. You could be right there working with the firefighter sometimes. Sometimes that might get their attention. Okay, everybody, that's pretty much going to cover everything that we wanted to cover in this session. And I hope that we have re-emphasized and reinforced a lot that you're already doing. And I wish that we had I'll just say the traditional method of doing the open conference so that we could be exchanging some ideas and so forth, but that's okay. You have an opportunity to put some things in the chat box. And if you are attending this session with other people, I do encourage you to discuss, as we mentioned earlier, discuss some of the things we've talked about, discuss how you're doing. And I do want to say, keep in mind, one of our primary objectives is to try to provide the service beyond that it is normally expected when we have a disaster. Okay, everybody, that's going to do it for me. As far as questions and feedback, if we let's see, have any questions? Let's see, I think we've got showing some questions there. And John, can you pull those questions up? But I think those may have been there before we got started. So if anybody's got any questions, don't hesitate to put them there in the question or in the chat box. Okay, everybody, I appreciate everything. And again, my name is Stephen Bardwell, and I think the Iowa Department of Homeland Security has my information. If there's anything that I can ever do for you and your organization, don't hesitate. It was a pleasure for me and a great opportunity for me as well. Thank you, everybody.